Hi, everybody. Good evening from Austin, Texas, where we're coming to you live. I'm Jay Bernhardt, Dean of the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. And on behalf of our college and our university, it's my great honor to welcome you to tonight's symposium called A Reflection on the Media in 2020. Today is, I think, December 9th, which means that there are exactly 22 days left in this year that we call 2020. Not that we're counting. But this year has been filled with many things. And one of the words we've heard most is unprecedented. This has been an unprecedented year for all of us, largely because we've faced multiple simultaneous crises and struggles. The pandemic, the economy, deep political divisions, and the widespread reckoning for racial justice, just to name a few. And through all of these crises, the media have been at the center in informing, and in some cases misinforming, the public about what's true, what's important, what to believe. It's in this landscape and this backdrop, the Center for Media Engagement, housed here in Moody College of Communication, has played an important role conducting research and sharing findings and expert guidance to support the media in the service of democracy. We're very proud to have the Center for Media Engagement as part of Moody College, and we're delighted that they are hosting and sponsoring our event this evening. Tonight, we'll hear from three distinguished speakers, including Washington Post reporter David Fahrenthold, Fox News Channel weekend anchor Arthel Neville, and former evening news anchor and creator of the news and media production company, fittingly called News and Guts, Dan Rather. Tonight's program will be moderated by Professor Talia Stroud. She's the founding director of the Center for Media Engagement here in Moody College, and she's a professor in the Department of Communication Studies and in the School of Journalism and Media. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for today's important discussion. I now would like to turn it over to Professor Stroud to lead our program.
Thank you so much, Dean Barnhart, for the introduction and for all of your support. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you this evening. As Dean Bernhardt mentioned, this event is being put on by the Center for Media Engagement. The center envisions a vibrant American media that more effectively empowers the public to understand, appreciate, and participate in the democratic exchange of ideas. The center emphasizes four main topics: journalism, propaganda, science communication, and media ethics. We are grateful to our funders, especially the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Democracy Fund, and the Hewlett Foundation. Since 2011, the center has partnered with over 130 news organizations and several major social media platforms to research their practices. Over 400 news organizations have changed a practice as a result of the center's work. We have over 100 free media ethics case studies in use by more than 80 schools, colleges, and universities. And if you're interested in learning more, please see our website at mediaengagement.org. There are several ways that you can participate tonight. Later this evening, we will ask our panel to answer some of your questions. To submit a question, you'll see a button saying Ask a Question next to the screen for you to use. We'll answer as many questions as we can. If you're full screen, you may need to drop off so that you can see this button and see the closed captioning if you'd like. You're also welcome to tweet with us this evening. Feel free to use the hashtag #ReflectionOnMedia. Our goal tonight is to think more deeply about the role of journalism and the work of journalists during this most tumultuous year. I can think of no more important moment to have this conversation. 2020 has seen a global pandemic, protests against police brutality, and a national conversation about race, and a contentious presidential election. We are lucky enough to have three people who have been at the forefront of these conversations with us tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce them to you. First, David Fahrenthold is a reporter covering the Trump family and its business interests. He has been at the Washington Post since 2000 and previously covered Congress, the federal bureaucracy, the environment, and the DC police. Fahrenthold is also an on-air contributor to NBC News and MSNBC. His awards include a Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting in 2017. Arthel Neville is a weekend anchor on the Fox News Channel covering breaking news, foreign policy, politics, and international headlines. America's News Headquarters is the only traditional newscast consistently in the top 10 rated shows in all of cable programming for the day. Ms. Neville began her career as a reporter in a highly respected local newsroom. 7 years in, she got her national break and forged an unmatchable career. She became the nation's first high-profile African-American female entertainment reporter. She hosted and produced a one-on-one celebrity interview show on E! Entertainment Television. Next, Ms. Neville launched Extra, a nationally syndicated entertainment news show broadcast to millions of viewers nightly. Our next speaker has a distinguished record of television around the globe. Dan Rather has covered virtually every major event in the world in the past 60 years, from his early local reporting in Texas on Hurricane Carla to his unparalleled work covering the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the civil rights movement, the White House and national politics, wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Persian Gulf, Somalia, Zimbabwe, Yugoslavia, and Iraq. He was on the scene during the Tiananmen Square uprising. From his first days as the Associated Press reporter in Huntsville, Texas in 1950, Rather has more than earned his reputation as the hardest working man in broadcast journalism. In 2006, Rather founded the company News and Guts and became an anchor and managing director of HDNet's Dan Rather Reports, which specializes in investigative journalism and international reporting. This work now continues on Access and social media. He has received virtually every honor in broadcast journalism, including numerous Emmy and Peabody awards. Rather has also authored or co-authored 9 books, 5 of which have become New York Times bestsellers. Most recently, What Unites Us, Reflections on Patriotism, released in November of 2017. Thank you all so much for being here. Let's dive right in. Mr. Rather, in the book, What Unites Us with Elliot Kirchner that I just mentioned, you write that presently, the institution of a free press in America is in a state of crisis greater than I have ever seen in my lifetime, and perhaps in any moment in this nation's history. Why do you think this is the case?
Well, in no particular order, these are among the reasons. First of all, a free and independent, truly independent, fightingly independent press has been under unrelenting political and ideological attack for some years now, really beginning in no later than the late 1970s, early 1980s, and accentuated in the last few years with the President of the United States dedicated to diminishing the public's trust in the press. So that's one factor. The rise of outright propaganda, straight ahead propaganda, unrelentingly so, has taken its toll. Again, these are in no particular order. Number two, the disappearance of the old business model, which supported overwhelmingly journalism as we knew it, which is to say it was advertisers supported, that the journalistic institution or operation, whether it be small newspaper or big network, used the income from advertising, part of it, to do journalism's basic work, including at its best, but not confined to this, deep digging in investigative reporting, first-class international reporting, and extensive local news reporting by local news outfits. The business model was smashed by the internet. And with very few exceptions, nobody has come up with a business model that will replace it and that can finance integrity-filled journalism in the name of public service, as we once had it. Number three, and it ties into what I just said, the consolidation of media. By and large, fewer and fewer competitors who are truly national distribution news media. And the other factors, the diminution of the line between news and entertainment, all of these factors have contributed to the diminution of public trust in the press. I do want to say that I would add to this that those of us who are in journalism have made our mistakes, and I've certainly included myself in that criticism, that we haven't been as good of listeners as we should have been, and we haven't been as humble as I think we probably should have been.
Thank you for kicking us off with that important answer. Ms. Neville, what do you think from your vantage point?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and I'm humbled to be in such outstanding and accomplished company. You know, I agree with Mr. Rather in a couple of points, and then again, in no particular order as well. There's been a muddling and thus confusion about what is news and what is opinion. And I think that part of that is due to there's so many sources, and I'm certainly not demonizing the entire brand of social media, the whole category, if you will, but you can find anything you want on the internet to support what it is that you would like to think and believe. But I think that, in journalism, again, it's not helpful for a journalist or the profession of journalism to be demonized as enemy of the people, and to have it sort of the trust picked away and picked at by people of power. We are in the Constitution for a reason. It helps to bolster our democracy, to make sure there are checks and balances. So I think that, and kind of what Mr. Rather also talked about business models. There are so many outlets out there, which is great for business. That's what we live in, a world of capitalism. So, we can, various people can get into various businesses and profit, et cetera, which is not to say that profit is the main driver, but it is business. So my point to that is, because there's so many sources, unlike before, I think that again, sometimes people get confused as to what is real and what is not. So all we can do as journalists is to stick to the truth as we know it, dig into the story as best we can, and you're right, when we make a mistake, you come on and you say it immediately, and therefore people know that you don't have any hidden agendas. And if you make a mistake, you say it, and they realize that, again, your whole idea is to be fair and to be honest and to be truthful.
Thank you so much for that. And how about you, Mr. Fahrenthold?
Well, I think there's not much more to say. They've made a great point. There's just one thing I noticed in President Obama's new book. He talked about his experience campaigning in 2008, where he would say, going around Iowa, you'd go to a small town and there'd be kind of a guy in a bow tie who was the editor of the local paper. And you met with that person. Maybe Obama says maybe that guy was a conservative. Maybe he didn't agree with you. But he was somebody who would give you a fair hearing, and then he was trusted by the people in that community. And if you could win that guy over, if you could answer his questions, you would reach somebody who people knew in that area. And then Obama says, come back in 2016, campaigning for Hillary, that guy and his paper are gone. And a lot of those small town news sources are gone now, just not only hollowed out, but they don't exist. And so what fills the space, or what we hope will fill the space, are outlets like mine, newspapers that now used to serve one city and now try to serve the country. But we are coming to those folks, I think, without understanding what we look like to them. And by that, I mean something that Arthel talked about, that we often mix news and opinion in ways that are obvious to us, ways where, in our mind, it's easy to tell what's opinion and what's news. But if you're reading the Washington Post for the first time, it may not be. And so I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that if we're going to fill in this gap, to fill in all these folks who've lost their local source of news, we need to be better at explaining who we are and why they should trust us versus all of the thousands of other things that look like news or that are news from a particular ideological vantage point.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think a really important observation. I'm hoping that now we can turn to some of the most pivotal events of the past year. This week, the US broke records for the number of coronavirus deaths in a week. Do the media have a responsibility to encourage the public to follow public health guidelines? And how do you think this will play out when the vaccine becomes widely available? Ms. Neville, if I might, I know you were covering this over the weekend. Let's start with you.
Well, the main thing is to stick to the facts, follow the science, and report the science and the facts. And I think every time that you can, so that's first and foremost, but when you can also humanize any story, which is what I strive to do, once you do that, and you realize, I feel like that's a way to kind of break down the barriers that separates us as people. And if you realize that we're all people with the same desires for family and, stability and security and all those things, and really you are not different from me as a human being. And so when you put those human faces on any story, particularly this story, because there's such division over a vaccine of all things, and you also make sure, so again, back to the top, it's follow the science. And this science is going to change because this is a novel coronavirus. And even the scientists will say what they knew 8 months ago is different from what they know now. And, I try my best to put on scientists, doctors who are in the making of the sausage, if you will, of these particular vaccines, and people who will say, this is right, we got this right, we got this wrong. So when it's time, and I ask this over and over, this one question I'll ask every time, is it safe? Can we trust the vaccine? Because that's what I want to know. That's what you at home, that's what you want to know. So as long as you, I feel like, cover this and make sure you stick to the facts, you don't get into any of the salacious insanity that has politicized a vaccine of all things, a virus of all things. So you do that, and you just get it right. Just get it right. It's so important. And what I wanted to say is that you have to respect people. You can't come at a story and assume that everybody, is on board with this. People may have medical reasons for not getting vaccinated. There are people who with religious purposes for not getting vaccinated. So again, you can't denigrate or dismiss someone's valid concern over this. But what I don't condone are the conspiracy theories circling out there about a vaccine. That's not what we're doing here. So, again, in summation, I'd say stick to the facts and humanize the story at every given turn.
Great suggestions there. Mr. Fahrenthold, you've covered the pandemic in several articles this year. What would you add?
I think Arthel had it right. Some of the most powerful stories I've read about the coronavirus are, we have this series this year called Voices from the Pandemic, where we've talked there. It's basically as told to stories, first person stories by a funeral director, an EMS director, somebody with COVID, somebody who's afraid of getting COVID, and hearing them talk about what their experience was like. I feel like there's nothing more powerful than reading, somebody like you who's suffering from this. So I think it is important for us to take, people should wear masks, they should listen to the scientists. But as Arthel said, giving it in the voice of somebody else, not me, but, here's somebody who's really living with it. I think that's the most powerful thing you can do.
And Mr. Rather, what would you add?
Well, first of all, I want to echo the sentiments stated earlier. It's very important to stick to the facts and to tell people this is what we know, this is what we think we know but are not sure of, and this is what we don't know. Always be careful to separate those things and explain to people the difference, and follow the science and follow the scientists. I'm happy to say that that there's been a renewed interest on journalists being better prepared to report on science. I'm stumbling a little bit here because I've never been particularly good reporting science, and I wish I were better. But all of us have to get better, particularly in this, and let's have it out, that from the president on down, there's been an anti-science movement in the country, a real effort to diminish public confidence in science, of all things. And as journalists, we can be important in offsetting that, but stick to the facts, listen to the scientists, do all you can to explain why science changes as it goes. Science, after all, is basically curiosity. And I know some people get frustrated and angry. They say, well, the scientists told me one thing back in March, they tell me another thing now. This is a good role for journalists to explain why that is true, that scientists are learning as they go. But all of these, I think, are things we need to have in mind as we go through. But in the end, I would also say, to underscore what David mentioned earlier, it's an old rule in journalism. Don't tell me about 10,000 people. Tell me about one person, which is another way of saying that I think the story really comes to life when you can concentrate on one person or one family and really dig deep into that story and bring it to screen or bring it to print is the most effective thing. And one other thing I would say is that all of us, and I include myself in this, we tend to emphasize numbers and charts. I believe that photographs are stronger than charts, and particularly, as we say in television, pictures that wiggle, which is to say television pictures are particularly strong. And But beyond that, I also think that it's really important to be listening to people. What are the public's questions? We tend to kind of make up the questions as we go from our own head, but this is what reporting is about, is getting out there and listening. What are the questions in the public's mind? What are they thinking? And try to come up with the answers.
I love that so much. Turning to the next topic for us, what grade would you give the media in covering the campaign, the election, and its partisan aftermath, and why? Mr. Fahrenthold, you've been writing extensively about Trump and the election aftermath. What do you think?
Well, I think that the media has actually done, at least I'll speak for us, the Washington Post, the part I've been part of. I think we've done a really good job of covering the aftermath and a better job of covering the election than we did in 2016. The aftermath has been a really disturbing period to be a reporter, to watch huge numbers of people led by the president deny a reality, right? And to deny something that is like sort of at the heart of our system. America is about the peaceful transfer of power, and to see people sort of trying to undermine that as ham-handedly and ineffectively as they have is a disturbing thing to write about. But I feel like the media has been very good, at least, in my experience, at calling out what was true, what was not, and not falling victim to not becoming a part of the charade, not passing along things that are untrue, even in the attempt to debunk them. I think that's taken us a long time to adjust to the Trump era, but that's one thing that I think we've gotten better at is, just because the president said something doesn't mean you need to tell everybody he said it if it's not true. So I think I would say we've done a good job. I mean, the election aftermath is not over, but so far I think we've done a much better job at sort of understanding our role, which is to tell people what's true and not just tell people everything somebody said.
Thanks for that. Mr. Rather, let's go to you next.
Well, I suspect there'll be no surprise, but I do think that the press, which is a word I prefer to media, but I understand why media is used here, has done an increasingly good job over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think overall and in the main deserve high marks. Hasn't been perfect, but part of explaining journalism to people is that journalism is not an exact science. It's a kind of crude art, even on its best days. But I think the media deserves overall and in the main high marks. And I would say especially some of the larger media institutions, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today to some degree, and the major networks, I would say ABC, NBC, and CBS, that they've done a pretty good job. I think they deserve at least a B plus or an A minus. I would give them a full A, because for one thing, there has been a renewal of really important investigative reporting. This were the Times and the Washington Post. I mean, give them both double Pulitzers or whatever, because their management has financed that and stood behind that reporting. This is a really major thing, and I would say that's the main reason I'd give the media overall at least a B plus or an A minus.
Excellent. And Ms. Neville, what about you?
I agree with what Mr. Rather says, and I don't really have much to add to that.
Okay. Next topic. In 2020, we saw protests against police brutality across the country, an important national conversation about race. What do you think that the media's role should be in this conversation? And do you think that they achieved it? Mr. Rather, you've covered and written about issues of race. Let's start with you.
Well, I'm not sure that I understand the directness of the question. I understand the subject is the question of what we should be doing.
Mm-hmm. What should the media be doing in this conversation, and have they achieved what they should be doing?
Well, I think it's true of all subjects with journalists, but particularly in this subject, we need to listen. We need to listen to the voices, particularly the voices how do we describe them? Communities of color. I don't like that phrase. It's an awkward phrase and perhaps an unfair one. But to listen, there's no question that the press has gotten better, but it's still heavily weighted toward white America, which remains the majority of the country, but the demographics are shifting so much. So number one, we need to listen more, particularly to go into the communities where people of color tend to be centered sometimes, and go into those communities and sit and listen, and to continually try to understand that within given communities, minority communities, there's great diversity. For example, to say that Black America or Black Americans isn't enough anymore. There are great differences in Black America, and that's true with the Latinx community and the Asian community right on down the line. I frankly think that the diversification in hiring of people of color is not nearly what it could be and should be in journalism, to say the least. But I do think that there's still a tendency, and again, I do not accept myself from this criticism, to be a little reluctant to report the truth as we know it to be in such areas as just one example in the criminal justice system. There's a need for really deep and widespread reform in the criminal justice system. And anybody who's been a cub reporter and covered the police beat for any length of time knows what happened at the police station after midnight on Saturday night, knows what happens in the worst of prisons. But there's still a reluctance to bring it out into the sunlight, to use the metaphor. And those are among the things I think we have to get busy doing, but nothing greater than listening to the voices in the country and understanding how greatly the demographics of the country have changed over the last 50 to 75 years.
Thank you for that. Ms. Neville, what would you add?
I think beginning with the horrific killing of Mr. George Floyd, I believe that the media have done a good job of bringing those images into people's homes, because I think for the first time it became real. And it came at a time when people were stuck inside. They were glued to the television. They were reading too, of course, but more people were watching the news. And so for those images to be seared into people's mind, I think it snapped a lot of people into realizing, wait a minute, this is real. This is a problem. So for instance, but the way to cover this, listen, there's so many, there's so many complexities involved. And the way to cover it, of course, is responsibly. And here's an example. I had Mr. Floyd's brother, Felonious, and his cousin and their attorney, Mr. Crump, on. And I made sure to get them, and I was happy to bring them to my particular audience. And I spoke to them, and again, it's about bringing out the human side. And when people see that, wait a minute, this guy is grieving for his brother. And what I did not get into is you have to be careful. Oftentimes people want to get into someone's background. That had nothing to do with what happened at that particular moment. And that's where you focus. Okay. And what I also made sure to get Mr. Floyd's brother to repeat on air, because he said it, I had already spoken to them, I know what his sentiment was. And I said, so you are not calling to defund the police, correct? And he says, no, I am not calling for that. So what is the purpose behind that? It is to cut down on the confusion and the disinformation. And that right there is to calm down the flames and the tension, because people wanted to label, it's all about labels, and you have to be very careful and methodical and to make sure that you are not contributing to that, and that our job is to provide clarity. And I think that when things are clear, thoughts are clear, intentions are clear, and of course they want justice, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as long as intentions are made clear, then again, I feel that calms down the fires that were literally burning and figuratively burning. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's kind of what popped into my mind in terms of that coverage.
Yeah, really helpful. Mr. Fahrenthold, would you add?
No, all well said. I got nothing to add.
Okay. I'd like to turn to a couple of questions about the media. And at one point or another, all of you have been criticized by President Trump. What effect do you think that this criticism has had on you or on the journalism profession at large? Mr. Fahrenthold, let's start with you. What do you think?
Well, I think the first thing to know is if you're criticized by President Trump, you shouldn't think that you are special. I mean, there's not a lot of reporters out there who haven't been criticized by him directly or indirectly. So to me, the times when he's been critical of me personally, it's a good opportunity because it brings people's attention to you, and you can use that to sort of show people, look, here's who I am, here's what I'm writing about, here's what I've done to try to capture President Trump's perspective. Here's all the things that I've done to try to capture his voice and to sort of give him a chance to say his piece. The danger, I think, is just that you don't want the story to be about him and the idea that there's some sort of feud between you. I've been okay with the attention that I've gotten, but I haven't wanted to make it into something where I'm like feuding back and forth with him or continuing some sort of relationship, because it's not really about that. He's the president, I'm just some guy, but I'm here to tell, what matters is what I've found out, what I'm here to tell you. It's not really about, my personality and any sort of relationship I have with him.
Ms. Neville, what would you say?
I think that it says you're doing your job, which is not to attack the president, not to protect the president, but to report on the president and to be fair. The trolls come after you, but so what? It's part of it in this day of social media. But no, it just, again, says I'm doing my job and I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing.
And you, Mr. Rather?
Well, it's always important to keep in mind what my journalism professor back at Sam Houston State Teachers College in 1950 always drilled in our head, which is don't let them scare you. Anytime you get under attack, and let's face it, if you do quality, integrity-filled journalism, sooner or later, you're going to be under attack. And while it's kind of a smart aleck remark, there's some truth to the old saying that if you're in journalism and you want a friend, you better get a dog. Because if you do your job as you should be doing it, sooner or later, you're going to catch hell. And naturally, if you cover the president in any way, even on the periphery, even aged and worn out anchor people covering, you have to understand that sooner or later, you're going to catch hell. The way I put it is sooner or later, you're going to have to face the furnace and take the heat. But I get back to what was said earlier. You just do your job. Don't let them scare you. And constantly try to send by word and deed to the people who are consuming your news consumers, that you're trying to do your job. You're trying to be fair. I sometimes say to people, which is true, that I'm not left wing, I'm not right wing, I'm not chicken wing. I'm out there as a working reporter doing the best I can.
An interesting segue into my next question for you, which is, all of you in the organizations for which you work have been accused of being biased and favoring either the political right or the political left, and on some occasions both. How do you handle these accusations? And do you think there's a problem of political bias in journalism today? Mr. Rather, can you start us off?
I'm sorry, did you call on me?
If you would start us off, that would be
great. Not what it once was, and I'm sorry, I didn't want to step on someone's lines. Well, first of all, here's where I don't think we've done as good a job as we could have done and should be doing in explaining what it is we're trying to do as journalists. What is it we think we're doing? Very important to explain that to people, and then people can make their own decisions on how well or how poorly they think we're doing it. Most journalists overwhelmingly, what we think what we are trying to do is get to the truth, or as close to the truth as is humanly possible, and to tell it. Now that's what we set out to do. And the second thing is, in the course of doing that it's not humanly possible to squeeze out your biases. We all have them totally, completely, every day on every story. But one test of how good a journalist one is how hard they try to do that and how often they succeed. We don't do a good enough job, I think, explaining that again, anytime that you do the kind of quality journalism that includes investigative reporting, for example, and the higher you go, whether it's the mayor or the governor or the president, the higher you go, the more you're going to be accused of having bias. It goes with the territory. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that none of us are without bias, and we expect to be judged. I expect to be judged, and every other quality journalist I know expects to be judged of how often we do the job fairly as humanly possible, how often to succeed in squeezing out our own biases or not. But I do think that there's a great difference between bias and being analytical. We may want to touch on this later on in the broadcast. And again, schooling, if you will, educating the public to the difference of what we might call straight journalism, analysis, commentary, opinion, and editorials. Those are different roles that different journalists perform. Sometimes the same journalist will perform the different role in different times. But explaining that to people, we haven't done a very good job of doing it. But there's a saying among football coaches: "You are what your record is." And I think for most of us, when we face these charges of being biased, that if you've been around any length of time at all, the best thing is to say, "Look at my record. Here's my record. You make a judgment whether you think that I've tried to be fair or not."
Great sentiment. Miss Neville, what would you add?
Well, I always say that we're human beings. So you have a perspective, you've lived life. So as far as not being objective, you do have a perspective, but that doesn't matter. What matters is to be fair.
Fantastic. Mr. Fahrenthold, what would you add?
I always worry about people who come to the Washington Post for the first time. We're lucky enough that somebody who hasn't read us or doesn't read us regularly comes to the Washington Post. The concern I have about bias is, are we doing something that drives that person away? When they come to us to read a particular story, come to our homepage, do they see something there where they go, "Well, these people are out to skew the news for one side or another"? Or when they read our news, do they understand how hard we work to make sure that we got the full truth? So, I am concerned, obviously, about going into stories, asking the wrong questions or looking for the wrong answer. But I also am concerned about showing that to people. How do we make sure that when people come to us for the first time, that we don't do something that drives them away because they think that we're out to prove a point instead of just to tell the truth?
Thank you for that. Yeah, the ideas of transparency here are really, really interesting. I want to do one rapid fire round here, if we might, and then we'll continue with our program tonight. And that is that each of you use social media in different ways or have encouraged others to do so. And I'll offer some examples. Mr. Rather, the post that has garnered the most engagement from you over the past 6 months was one tweet that read, "Dude, you lost." Mr. Fahrenthold, in your book, Uncovering Trump, The Truth Behind Donald Trump's Charitable Giving, you describe asking the public to help you with your reporting via Twitter. And Ms. Neville, you have reported that some Americans are ignoring social distancing guidelines and introduced a slogan that I think is worth repeating: "Don't roam, stay at home."
Yes.
I'm hoping that I can turn to each of you to get your reactions on what is the role of social media in journalism these days. And Mr. Rather, if I could start with you.
Well, the role is reaching widespread dissemination almost instantaneously. This is what is contributing to changing journalism, as we talked about as we opened the program with the changes in journalism. With the internet, you reach more people faster with more content than has ever been possible before. And this acceleration of the pace of change has necessitated all kinds of changes for journalists, one of which is the premium on the internet. And I didn't make these rules, but if you're going to be on the internet, and particularly in social media, part of the rules is you need to be quick, you need to be short and pithy if possible, and you need to be careful, because a mistake, particularly a mistake of fact, will go worldwide, flash around the world, and that old saying, "The truth has a hard time catching up with it," is true. That I do think that the following is true, and it's open to debate, but this is my own opinion, clearly labeled, that if you're in journalism today, being on social media to some degree is not an option. That if you want to be relevant, if you want your work to be relevant, even on the faint far edges, as is the case of my own, then it's not a choice that you have to be on the internet. And the quicker you get on it and the better you understand what works and what doesn't work. The temptation, and I'll wind up with this because we could spend the rest of the evening talking about this one subject. At ease, folks, we're not going to spend the rest of the evening talking. You'll be relieved. But the temptation is so great. The premium is on how many clicks you get, how many people respond to what you do. And there's an enormous undertow to play to that, to say, instead of saying, what's important? What's the most important thing I can write about, what I can put up? You begin to think, what's going to get the most clicks? That's a very dangerous road for any journalist. Of course, in previous generations, and we, to some degree, we still have, well, if you're a newspaper, what's going to raise the circulation? Those conversations have been going on in newspapers forever. I'm sure, David, at the Washington Post, high-toned as it is, nobody talks about circulation. But in most of journalism, people are concerned about circulation of the ratings. But to the extent that it's pervasive with social media and the internet, it's a danger for every journalist, including this one, to say to yourself, well, I haven't done anything in the last few days that got a lot of clicks, so what's going to get the most clicks instead of what's the most important thing I can contribute?
Fantastic, Mr. Fahrenthold.
To me, I use social media as a way to show readers what I'm doing, to be transparent about the reporting process. Here's what I'm trying to find out. Here's what I don't know. Here's what I do know. And to ask their help, which surprisingly works. It works much more often than you think. It surprised me even this year after I've been using it for a few years. If you ask for something that seems completely impossible, doesn't always work, but there are times when your readers really surprise you. And to me, the key to doing that has been to just make my social media presence about my reporting and my stories. It's not about me or my opinions or my pop culture knowledge, which are completely uninteresting as they could possibly be, more uninteresting than the average journalist. I just don't do that stuff because people aren't interested in it. And I want people, when they come to my Twitter feed, to see what I'm doing and to be drawn back to the story. If I've got you as an audience, I want to I picture my readers as like swirling around in a tornado of news and opinion, misinformation, disinformation. And if you've managed to grab onto my story once, how can I give you a way to hold on to that thread and follow it? Follow it forward in time to what I'm going to do next, follow it back to what I've done before. And if you fly off in the tornado and come back again, how can I help you catch up? So to me, that's what social media is. It's a way to let people follow the thread and hang on to my thread, even as the tornado swirls around them.
Good.
I like that metaphor. Ms. Neville, what would you add?
I don't use social media to really share my reports. My experience with social media, that it's a sewer for trolls. And so I don't really care what they think. And so therefore I don't invite their opinions. So I don't really participate. And if I do tweet a link, for instance, it's again with a scientist or something that is so has nothing to do with politics, so no one can sit there and either try to figure out what I'm thinking or something that's going to be divisive, because I don't want that. That's not what I'm here for. And so also what I do mainly is I really don't do a lot of tweeting. Mainly I do the other stuff, and it's just to show the kind of fun I'm having as a person. I feel like if you get to know me, the more you get to know me as a person, you'll realize again that I have no hidden agendas. And that's the main thing that I want people to know. And I'll end on this quote that I wrote several years ago, and it still stands. And it speaks to, again, gives you an idea of who I am, which is what I bring. And we said earlier how we do have a perspective. We're not completely objective. What I bring to my reporting is my love of people and my desire for people to be together. And the quote that I wrote is, it's lead the race to share similarities and embrace differences.
Wonderful. I love that. That is a fantastic quote. We are now going to turn to two undergraduates at the University of Texas. Jimena Pinzon is a third-year journalism student and an undergraduate research assistant at the Center for Media Engagement from Frisco, Texas. She works with the propaganda team, focusing on disinformation and geolocation data used for the surveillance of protests. Natalie Deller is a senior from Corpus Christi, Texas, studying political communication and government at the University of Texas. She has worked on various projects at the center over the past year, most recently our research on coronavirus coverage, and I will turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you for the introduction. Mr. Fahrenthold, our first question is for you. What was the difference in covering Trump's business ordeals in 2020 versus 2016, and did the stakes change?
The biggest difference for me in 2020 versus 2016 was it was harder. In 2016, I was mostly writing about Trump's dealings with charity, his promises to give to charity, the times he used charity money. And so he wouldn't tell me anything about that. So I was reliant on public documents and on other people who might have had some contact with him. And in the charity world, there actually were a lot of those other sources. Charities have to file tax documents, so you could see the internal finances of his Trump charity. And also, every dollar he gave or everything he bought with charity money was bought from somebody else. And those people, not always, but a lot of the time, would talk to me when I called. Fast forward to 2020, I'm now writing about Trump's business. So about his individual business and his business dealings with both the government, his government, and other businesses. Those are much harder nuts to crack because those are folks who have obviously some ongoing loyalty to Trump and some ability to benefit from him. So it took a lot more work to try to make sources in that world and a lot more use of the Freedom of Information Act process. That was the real savior for us in 2020 was we found the FOIA system to get information about the federal government spending at Trump properties. And then we basically learned how to fight the FOIA system to actually get the documents we wanted. So it was a big success that we got what we wanted 7 months after we asked for it. And that took a lot of effort to get there. So the biggest change from 2016 to 2020 was that the sources got a lot harder, but the stakes to me only got higher because now we're talking about not how Trump used other people's money, but how he's using our money, how he's using taxpayer money without us knowing it.
Thank you for your insight.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Fahrenthold. The next question is for you, Mr. Rather. You have said that propaganda is spreading faster than mildew in a damp basement. How has the spread of propaganda looked different this year, given the pandemic, election period, and protests?
Well, first of all, it's unique in my experience and what we've gone through this, particularly this year, with the twin terrors of the pandemic and the severe economic drop of those two things, of course, are related. That never before in my experience has there been a president, and I've been involved in one way or the other trying to cover presidential politics since at the very latest 1954, 56, in which you had a president who relentlessly and constantly dealt in outright lies. I'm one of those people that have difficulty using the word lie, at least I used to, because it's such a harsh word, but it's apt. The consistency with which the president just lied, there were many days when he would tell 20 or 30, 40 lies in one day as a way of underscoring the propaganda. That it was constant, unrelenting, and it came from the president. And one of the powers of the presidency is the power to persuade. The sheer power of the office gives any president a great deal of power to persuade. So it was unique in that regard. And to tell you the truth, I was surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, even though we'd been through a lot with President Trump since he came first into office. To lie about something as serious as a pandemic, well, that word unprecedented certainly comes into play with that. And the president's allies in the press, there's no joy in saying this, that he has allies in the press who serve to be just conveyor belts for his propaganda. the combination of that led to a second surprise, which is how effective it became. That I don't think the majority of the American people perhaps never succumb completely to propaganda, but a higher percentage than I would have ever thought possible. Maybe 35 or 40% of people fall in line. And then the third point, of course, is how dangerous this is to spread propaganda about something as serious as the coronavirus. And my own opinion, clearly labeled, is that this kind of leadership from the top costs lives and costs a lot of lives. And to be perfectly candid with you, I've yet to quite get over the shock and the outrage that's engendered.
Thank you so much for your insights.
Ms. Neville, how has broadcast journalism adapted to 2020 tsunami of information? And in what ways has this year been different from other years in your career?
It's true. The amount of misinformation, disinformation is very disheartening. It's disturbing. It's damaging to our democracy. Excuse me. So you have to do your job, and that is to stay focused, to keep the blinders on, and deal with the truth.
Thank you.
And this last question for the student-led segment is for all of you, what advice would you give UT student journalists who are entering the journalism professional world today? And we'll go ahead and start with you, Mr. Fahrenthold.
My advice is to think about your audience always. I talked about sort of how your readers or your viewers, whoever you're trying to reach, are lost in this tornado of good news, bad news, fake news, opinion. If they find you, think about how to keep hold of them. And that's part of your job too. In addition to reporting the news, covering the beat you're on, making sure that folks who care about what you care about can follow the thread of your reporting and can keep following it. Think about that in terms of the way you write your stories. You write them iteratively, so you tell them a little bit at a time to keep people interested, but also in how you use social media. Just be so conscious of that you can never count on the fact that if people read you once and go away, that they'll come back and read you again. You have to work to keep them.
Thank you so much for that. And we'll go on to you, Ms. Neville.
Be curious and learn the basics. So it doesn't matter if you want to be an entertainment reporter, a health reporter, a political reporter. You have to be a reporter. So learn how to be that first and foremost. And if you're getting into it for some sort of grandiose reason of wanting to be a star or something like that, or wanting to be on TV, wanting attention, don't do it, because it's disingenuous and you're going to make horrible mistakes and decisions, and somewhere along the line, you're going to compromise your integrity. You never compromise your integrity. And again, I'll go back to the top when I say be curious. I mean, you want to know as much as you can about a lot of things, you see, because that is what's going to broaden your base and, fortify your arsenal of information and knowledge. And that comes across in your comfort level of what it is you're doing. Now, you're not going to be so, confident walking out the gate, but you're going to learn the foundation. And I got the basics down there at UT. That's where I went to journalism school. That's where I graduated from. So again, learn the basics.
Thank you so much for that advice. And lastly, you, Mr. Rather.
Well, I agree with what's been said before, and let me pause and say that I'm really honored to be in the program with two outstanding journalists, such as has been the case tonight. And I've learned a lot here tonight. But in answer to your question, advice to young journalists, it always begins and ends with me by saying, dedicate yourself to becoming as good a writer as you possibly can. Writing is the bedrock of the craft, no matter whether it's television or radio or whatever. And also, writing teaches you to think, and particularly do analytical thinking. So it's always about the writing with me when it comes to advice to young journalists. No matter how good a writer you think you are, And all of us sort of come out of school, journalism school, thinking we're pretty damn good writers, and until we get into the field and realize how much we have to learn. But if you dedicate yourself to a lifetime of always trying to improve yourself as a good writer, you can do pretty well in the profession. The second thing is, don't lose your idealism. Most people get into journalism because they're particularly idealistic. It's such a tough craft, particularly in the early years when you're trying to get established, that it's very easy to become cynical. Or you can be skeptical, but never cynical. But I'd just say, don't lose your idealism. And don't forget that, hearts can inspire other hearts with their fire. And you, even as a beginning journalist, your enthusiasm and your idealism will serve you very well, but it also can be contagious and therefore a credit to your craft.
Thank you all so much for your excellent answers and wonderful advice. Now we're going to bring Professor Stroud back in.
Thank you so much, Natalie and Jimena. And now let's turn to questions from you. As a reminder, you can enter your question by clicking on Ask a Question. And behind the scenes, Gina Masulo, Associate Director of the Center for Media Engagement, and others will help us get through as many as possible. And our first question is from Robert Burns. He notes, it's no secret that the president has been loose with facts during his administration. Is it a responsibility of the media to call out the lies to readers and viewers? Did the media do a good job? Mr. Fahrenthold, would you like to start us off on this one?
Sure. I think that there are times when we just should not amplify his lies. There are times, obviously, when his lies are important or when they're causing some sort of major change or political movement, when you write about them and people talk about doing that through the truth sandwich, right? You say what the truth is, you say what Trump says, and you say that it was wrong. So the first thing people get out of you is the truth, not the lie. But I think we have unwittingly on social media and sometimes in our broadcasts and on our websites have amplified Trump's lies, thinking we are debunking them or putting them away, but really we're just showing people something that's not true. So I feel like we should always think about, is it worth showing people this thing that is not true? Is it important enough to show it to them, even if we're going to debunk it later? So I think we are now erring more on the side of not showing people stuff than we were 4 or 5 years ago.
Ms. Neville, what would you add?
I agree. It's kind of like this. If someone tells you, this is how you pronounce it, it's tomato, not tomato. Well, now don't tell me tomato, just tell me tomato. You've amplified now tomato.
Somebody fantastic. Mr. Rather, I turn to you.
Well, I do agree with David that there's been some reassessing about this. In the main, I subscribe to the idea, if the president of the United States tells a lie, that's a demonstrable lie. A lie is something that's absolutely false, and the teller knows it to be false. I lean and have leaned for years to the idea, anytime particularly a president of the United States does that, you need to point it out. However, President Trump is hit by his actions, and so constantly lying, I've had to adjust, and I think a lot of people in journalism have, and that is to edit and make a decision by repeating the lie. Do you help him? And that's sometimes a very tough call to make. But when in doubt, I would run it, because I think it's important people to know. But I want to make it very clear, do agree that some of the mistakes we've made, and I include myself in this in the past, of making so much of the lies that we help him out by spreading it. And increasing numbers of people will believe it, mostly because we say it's a lie. So it's a very tough call to make.
Well, the good news is, I think that moving forward, I think that the incoming administration respects tradition more. And so that doesn't mean they get a pass by any means. They're going to be scrutinized just like anyone else. But I think that there is going to be what has become to appear as combat journalism. So there's going to be digging, and there's going to be, there are going to be a lot of questions. But I think that and you tell me, David or Mr. Rather, if you agree with me, that I feel like it's going to be a little bit of a relief, a little able to exhale on a level, again, not giving anyone a pass. And if there is a lie, then it's going to be pointed out. But I think there's going to be less of this whack-a-mole that has been happening for the past 4 years.
And a great transition actually to our next question from Jillian, who says political media coverage intensified in 2016 when Trump became president. Do you think things will return to normal when Biden assumes office on January 20th, or has the news cycle changed for good? So, Ms. Neville, I don't know if you want to elaborate a bit on that, but you've certainly already taken us down this path of asking this very question.
Well, I think that the interest in politics, it's there. It's going to continue to be there, regardless of who is in office. Now, you may not have an exciting person as President Trump, just in his nature of how he operates. But I do believe that people have now, what this has done, it has put a spotlight on, and people are more interested in how our country works. And people are understanding now that you can't just ignore all the other, down ballot races. I think that there's more interest in civics and just how our country runs. So I think that will be there. It's just going to be a little bit different. It's not to say that it will be any less exciting to cover, but it's just going to be different. So I think the interest will still be there, but I think some of the gaslighting will stop.
Mr. Rather, what do you think?
Well, I do think returning to normal, I'm not sure what normal would be as we enter the third decade of the 20th century. We'll just have to see. I think my opinion, again, clearly labeled, is the press is going to go through a period in which those on the right, the extreme right, politically and ideologically, are going to quickly accuse the press of playing favorites. Now that we have a Democratic president that accuses of playing favorites, it's very important for the press to understand, each individual journalist to understand that our job is to, pull no punches, play no favorites, but at the same time not fall into the trap of false equivalency. Every small thing that the new president does, there'll be a tendency to say, well, the press doesn't make as much of it as they did under President Trump. We have to be careful about that. But, normal for the press is to ask questions, keep asking questions, knock on doors, and to, as David Fahrenthold has done so well, follow the dollar. And in the same way that the Washington Post and David distinguished themselves by following the money with President Trump, I'm sure that they're already busy following the money with President Biden, and we'll see how he stands up under that scrutiny.
And Mr. Fahrenthold, what would you add?
Well, it's so hard for me to predict how Trump will be covered next year when he's no longer president, right? Will he be on Twitter? He won't be who he was in 2016 when he was sort of seen as this kind of harmless diversion. I think how much time he spent on Morning Joe every day calling in. I don't think he'll have that kind of presence in the mainstream media the way he did, and he won't matter in terms of he won't be the president anymore. So it's hard for me to know how we'll cover him. I do think that we're going to cover. There'll be an effort to cover Biden as a quote unquote normal president, and that there already has been, scrutinizing his nominees, what are their records, who likes them, who doesn't like them. I think that will be very normal. The key for us, both as a business question and as a future of journalism question, is how do we keep the attention of all of these people who came in for sort of the daily car crash of the Trump era? There's so much going on in Washington that's important, but it's a little harder to dramatize than are we going to buy Greenland or not? And I think, how do we as journalists who write about Washington keep those people's attention and continue to sort of educate them and give them the truth and not let them sort of wander away?
I want to add something too. I think that how President Trump is covered post-presidency depends on the route he takes as well, which is not to say that the media should be, the coverage should not be determined by his actions. However, he could take various paths post-presidency. I'll leave it at that. We'll see what happens. And I had another thought. I want to also say that what journalists cannot do or should not do, in my opinion, is you cannot forget about there are 74 million people who voted for President Trump. There is a chunk of our fellow citizens who should not be ignored, should not be treated as lepers. They have concerns. You know, some are more mainstream, if you will. And, you know, I'm not talking about the fringe, but not everybody in the president's support group are, you know, on the part of the fringe, if you will. So I'm not sure, David, if you understand what I'm saying, if you want to put a button on what I'm saying, I'd love that.
Well, one of the interesting things for me is, like, you know, I used to cover Congress in its first days of the Tea Party, and I felt like we understood what the ideology was, you know, less government, less spending. Trumpism has as much fervor, but there's less ideology. It's more about a man, right? It's like his opinions could change every day, but they're always right. Like, once he's gone, or once he's in a position where he doesn't have any power anymore, you know, it's going to be interesting to see how we cover him, you know, because it's so much of it is personality driven. I don't know how much power his personality will have. And it'll be interesting to see whether people come along and speak to the same people who voted for him in ideological ways, and maybe a more personality-driven way. Like, who inherits that mantle, or does Trump try to keep it even when he's gone? That's going to be a big story, but, you know, it's really hard to predict, as you said, until we know what he's going to do, you know, how we'll cover it.
Yes, as we reflect on the year past, I think so many questions that are relevant for the year moving forward. Our next question shifts our focus just a little bit, and Jane Elizabeth asks, it's true that local media have been decimated, but there are still hundreds of local newsrooms working hard to cover important stories. What could national news organizations do to support local journalism? And Mr. Rather, I'll go to you first.
Well, the question is, what can national news organizations do to support local newsrooms? You know, I'm not quite sure. One thing that could be done is to work out some sharing arrangement. I'm not quite sure how the details of this could be done. For example, our largest news gathering organizations, and I'd like to make a difference between news gathering organizations and news packaging organizations. For example, some news organizations, particularly one or two in television, have become in recent years the packagers and presenters of news that other people gather. But what I'm talking about here is news gathering organizations like the Washington Post and the New York Times. Perhaps they could work out some sharing arrangement, leads on stories, helping to research out stories. This is a bit of a stretch. I'm just not quite sure where the greatest need is to come up with a new business model that for those local and regional newspapers that still exist, what can they do to increase their revenue, and what business structure can be put together? And you know, I'm not worth it. Flip it. Any kind of business, I can barely keep my own checkbook squared away. But that's the biggest need. I'm just not sure what national news organizations can do. And keep in mind that with few exceptions, that many of the national news organizations or very strong regional news organizations are part of very large international corporations. And those corporations are interested not in doing public service, not in seeing news as public service. They're driven only by the money. And that's going to make it very difficult for any sort of top-down help for local press organizations. I do think, if I may say so, that one of the things that would help those local news organizations that are still struggling to stay alive is to be very good at explaining to people what they would get out of subscribing to the paper. What's the advantage? You're urging people to subscribe to the paper or to join the paper on whatever internet capabilities they have, to work hard to explain to people what the advantages would be. But all of this, I know, it sounds pretty lame, because it is lame. That this is the struggle in journalism right now. what can we do to bolster the local and regional coverage? Because frankly, right now, we're in dire straits. That what used to be extensive coverage, for example, of state legislatures has virtually disappeared. And without the press to shine daylight into state legislatures, the amount of malfeasance and corruption that goes on in your average state legislature is growing by leaps and bounds. And that same thing, I think, can be said for county commissioners meetings and city council meetings, all those boring zoning hearings where the dirty work frequently gets done. There just isn't any sunshine shown on them anymore.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ms. Neville, you got your start in a local newsroom. What do you think?
In several local newsrooms. I started in local news, as you said, and I remain a proponent of local news. And I believe that local news should stop cannibalizing itself. And I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. I get it. They need to make money. They need to be able to survive. But what they're doing is they're watering down content. I'm not saying this is everybody is not painted with the same brush, but generally speaking, they don't want to pay for that investigative reporter who has that experience. They want to get people who are younger, and maybe they don't have to pay as much money for them. And listen, we all were cub reporters before, and you can only be as good as your experience. So you can be great coming out the gate in terms of your curiosity and your ability, and you may be one of that, very outstanding. But I feel that local news, again, they are trying to water down everything. And so, you're not going to get the advertising dollars. You need people with experience. You need to pay for those people, because those are the people who are going to be able to do those hyper local stories and do it well. So that's one way I think that local news could help itself realize its importance. And in this day and age of so much information that's out there, I need to know what's happening in my community. I need to know COVID. Where am I going to go get my test? Where can I get my test? Where am I going to get my shot? So while what we do nationally is extremely important, I believe that local, news directors and general managers and the people who own those stations need to understand that those stations are very, very vital. And newspapers and et cetera, the online versions of the newspaper.
And Mr. Fahrenthold, how about you? Anything to add about what national news source could do to support local journalism?
Well, to me, the two most promising examples that I know of folks who are coming and helping local journalism are two nonprofits. ProPublica, which is a national nonprofit that has given money to support local journalism and local reporters all over the country. And in Texas, the Texas Tribune, another great nonprofit newsroom that has partnered with the Houston Chronicle and other places to, they report the stories, or they help report the stories, and then use the San Antonio Express News, the Houston Chronicle, as a platform to publish their stories. So, those are nonprofits, not for-profits, but I think they're the ones who are sort of at the forefront of this effort right now.
And just keep the, I want to say, because I get this a lot. I feel that a lot of reporters who start in local news, their goal is to just get to national. And the way I have always said is, you imagine it like a ladder. If you walk up a ladder rung by rung, when you get to the top, you're going to stay there. But if you see a ladder and you try to run and jump up on the 5th step, that ladder is teetering and you're going to fall out. So stay in local news. I know when I was coming through, I couldn't imagine going from, market 110 to market 30. I couldn't imagine that. I knew I had to chart my course and, work my way up there. So there's something to that, guys. The grass is always greener. You think that, I want to be national, but you know what? You got to learn the basics. And I agree with Mr. Rather. Part of the basics, when I said that, it is writing. It is learning how to tell stories. It is learning how to edit. It is learning how to produce, because you need to have all of that. It's not just about being on TV. It's not just about, and I'm saying that because I'm sitting here as a television person, and Mr. Rather as well. So, he knows far better than I. But, guys, take your time. Get it right.
A theme we hear throughout tonight's discussion. Our next question comes from Andy Duchovny. And the question is, from your experiences from talking to people who are skeptical about COVID, how do you suggest people discuss COVID with skeptics? Who would like to start and take a stab at this one?
It's all about the facts. Present the science, period.
Mr. Rather, Mr. Fahrenthold, anything to add?
Go ahead, David.
No, I have had very little experience on this, so I'm glad to let others speak.
Well, forgive me. I'm sorry. I don't fully understand the question.
I think the idea is that if you met someone who is skeptical about coronavirus, what should you say to them?
Well, the first thing is I'd try to draw them out and listen as to why they're skeptical. This goes back to something I said earlier. What journalists, including this one, don't do enough of is listen. So the first thing I'd want to do is listen and try to draw the person out. Why are you skeptical about, let's say, the vaccine? What in your experience makes you skeptical? And then the best you can do is to begin to recite facts, stick as close to the facts as you possibly can, and lean heavily on the science. Say, these are the known facts that apply to your concerns. And this is what the best scientists, the authorities on the subject say. And also to understand how limited you are, that you can't persuade everybody. Sometimes people get things in their head and nothing you can say will change it. And unfortunately, there are people who take the attitude pretty much of, don't try to persuade me. With facts, I've already have my mind made up. And with those people, you're wasting your time to talk to them. But I still think you listen because you learn a lot by listening.
So we've had several moments this evening where we've mentioned humanizing others and focusing on a single person. And our next question comes from Avery Holton. And he asks, at a time when journalists are expected to be, or trying to be, more human in their connection with audiences, how can they display empathy without sacrificing their journalistic tenets? And Ms. Neville, I'll turn to you since you were the one that started our conversation about humanizing others.
Yeah. It's all about authenticity. You don't try to go for moments like, oh, I'm going to be funny. Oh, I'm going to get teary-eyed. You stay true to who you are and what you are and what you believe in. And then that is how people trust you. People know when you're pretending to be something you're not. And I believe that you can show your human side and maintain authority. And in fact, the more they see and feel like they know who you really are, if you're presenting what you see is what you get, then they trust you even more.
Mr. Fahrenthold, what would you add?
I feel like it's important for me as a reporter to show you how hard I'm trying to get things right. How much effort I'm putting into the questions I ask, to the search I'm doing. I want you to see what's real, which is that when we go into these stories, we try as hard as we can to make sure we get everything right, and we, to check every possibility. And so, to me, that's what I try to do when I'm on television, and what I try to do in social media is to try to explain, here's what I'm trying to find out, and here's the lengths I'm going to try to figure it out, on your behalf. Here's how hard I'm trying to get to the truth. I think if people believe that and they see the effort you're putting in, they're much more likely to trust what comes out of it, the stories you write.
Well, I'd agree with both of those. I would agree with both of the points that have been made earlier. And also, I've always found it at least mildly helpful. If people know your biography, I don't mean your whole life story, but particularly your journalistic biography. If they look at your record, I go back to the record, and if you're covering a war someplace, if they see on your record that you've covered other wars, perhaps that's a bad example, but any journalistic biographical material that you can put in the hands of your readers, your viewers, your listeners, I've always found to be helpful. As for, particularly on television, there's no place to hide. That you are going to come across for who and what you are if you're on television for very long. And any effort to fool people, to convince people you are something other than what you are, is doomed to fail. But, you know, again, with television, but I think it's true of journalism as a whole, that it's a matter of integrity, or perhaps better said, of genuineness. That if people will forgive a lot of mistakes if they know how hard you're trying. And this is the reason David's point, I think, is so strong, that people need to see the effort you're making to be accurate and to be fair. And the more you can do with that, the better it insures you against those days, and you will have days when you're wrong and you've made a mistake. But if you educated your viewers or your readers over the years to know, you know, this guy really tries hard, he's really working hard, and okay, he made a mistake. I'm not saying that you get total forgiveness, but the audience, they understand if you can help them understand what you do, how you try to do it, and how hard you try to be accurate and fair.
And I think all of you taking the time tonight to be with us and to explain from your different vantage points exactly what you see and reflect on the media's performance and coverage over this past year is a testament to exactly that. So I want to thank all three of you so much for being part of this. What a wonderful evening to think about the role of journalism and the work of journalists during this most tumultuous year. I cannot imagine having three more incredible panelists to think with us. Mr. Fahrenthold, Ms. Neville, and Mr. Rather, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Professor Straub, thank you very much.
At the Center for Media Engagement, we're dedicated to figuring out how the media can better serve its role in a democracy. And this conversation, we hope, will help all of us think about this more deeply. If you'd like to learn more about our work, we'd love for you to check out our website and social channels. Although this format does not allow us to applaud for our panelists, I am certain that we would be applauding them for their insights and thanking them for spending this evening with us. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to think about journalism and the media in this important year. On behalf of the Center for Media Engagement and the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin, I send you all our best for health and happiness, and again, our deepest thanks.